Thank you for joining us for tonight's real conversation. Critical race theory, how a legal framework became a political flashpoint. I'm Takia C. Graham, and I'm so excited to moderate tonight's discussion on such a timely topic. I'm a proud graduate of the University of Rochester, having received my master's degree in 2006 from the School of Arts and Sciences. I am currently a doctoral candidate in a higher education leadership program here at the Warner School of Education. I'm a tenured associate professor of English at Monroe Community College and an equity and inclusion strategist working with area K through 20 school faculty and staff to develop cultural competence in teaching materials. I am also the curriculum coordinator for East EPO's Step to College program. And last but certainly not least, founder and owner of Soul Sustainable Living, LLC, REAL. Rochester's Equity and Access Leadership Conversations is a virtual series focusing on authentic discussions around equity, measurable action, and meaningful change. Now, more than ever, when the topics of diversity, inclusion, equity, and access are central to today's pressing issues in our country, we as a university are committed to engaging in candid and courageous conversations, listening to each other, and to effective action to address these issues. This event is brought to you by the University of Rochester's Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, the Diversity Advisory Council, and the Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies. Our panel of accomplished professionals will share their thoughts on critical race theory, or CRT for short, the ways in which their work and research intersects with CRT, and how they believe CRT can help dismantle systems of oppression and ultimately make effective change for more equitable environments. Before we get started, I want to mention that we'll share some housekeeping and helpful Zoom tips in the chat box. If you would like to ask a question, you may submit it anytime through the Q&A function that is located at the bottom of the screen. I'm excited to welcome you all to share in this virtual space together and to introduce our esteemed panel. But first, I want to say thank you to our captioner and interpreters who are helping ensure that this program is accessible. First, please welcome Dr. Joanne Larson. Dr. Joanne Larson is the Michael W. Scanlon Professor of Education and Associate Director of Research at the Center for Urban Education Success at the University of Rochester's Warner School of Education. Since 2014, she has been conducting a long-term participatory ethnography with teachers, administrators, and students at East High School as part of the historic UR East Educational Partnership Organization. Joanne, thank you for joining us. Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Q. McCune Jr. Dr. Jeffrey Q. McCune Jr. is the Frederick Douglass Associate Professor of African American Literature and Culture and Director of the Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies at the University of Rochester. He is also the co-editor of Black Sexual Economies, Race and Sex in a Culture of Capital, and author of the award-winning book, Sexual Discretion, Black Masculinity and the Politics of Passing. He is presently completing 2 book projects, one of which is titled Disobedient Reading, an Experiment in Seeing Black, published by the University of California Press. Jeffrey, thank you for being here. Please welcome Anthony Plonzinski Figueroa. Anthony is an alumnus of the college and the Warner School of Education, where he is currently an EDD candidate in the teaching and curriculum track. Professionally, Anthony is a regional political organizer focusing in the Rochester area for New York State United Teachers. He is deeply connected to topics and issues related to critical race theory in this role, as well as a political and educational consultant. Additionally, he is involved with the local political landscape, serving as vice chair of the Monroe County Democratic Committee. Anthony, welcome. Last, but definitely not least, please welcome Elisa Victoria Prince. Alisa is an alumna of the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Rochester and is a current PhD candidate in the Visual and Cultural Studies program. Alisa is a scholar, artist, and curator of visual arts and artifacts of the Black diaspora. Based in critical race theory, her work focuses on the history of photography, the roles of race and gender in identity construction, and artistic forms of resistance. Currently, she jointly holds the Henry Luce American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship in American Art and the Chester Dale Fellowship in the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Alisa, thank you for joining us. Before I get started with our conversation and first question, I'd like to start with a little background. Since October 1st, according to Education Week, 27 states have introduced bills this legislative session to ban race-based education under the banner of critical race theory, a decades-old legal theory that considers how slavery and Jim Crow era politics affect present-day race relations. So let's talk about what it is, and maybe more importantly, what it is not, through the lens of our panelists. In a moment, we'll share some information in the chat box, which includes the 5 tenets of critical race theory and a brief explanation of the origin of CRT to get a general understanding of CRT. I'm going to ask this question to the panelists, so please, y'all, get ready for this groundbreaking and exciting conversation. So, after a brief explanation of the origin of CRT, which you all can see down in the chat box, to get a general understanding of CRT, which you can reference at any point in the discussion, right? So the first question will be focused to Dr. Larson, Joanne, she was one of our professors, and all of you can answer at any time. Using what's been shared in the chat as our guide tonight, our first question to you all is, what does critical race theory mean to you? And in what ways does CRT intersect with your work? What does critical race theory mean to you? And in what ways does CRT intersect with your work? This is for all the panelists. And Joanne, can you please start?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the description in the chat. For me, CRT means a way to see the world, kind of like a pair of glasses, in terms of how first defining endemic racism in the United States and understanding the role of this kind of base of this society, and how systems, educational, political, historical, social, intersect to oppress racial minorities, minoritized individuals. And this, in my research and my teaching, really helps me to see how systems work, racist systems work, and by identifying various data points, patterns, relationships. And in my teaching, it really helps to help my students, graduate students, to come to see, especially if they're white students, the role of whiteness as being privileged as a norm and how that oppresses others, and the ways that we can rethink that and rethink systems of oppression to so that there's more equity and justice. So it's very important to me to see the world in this way, and to help change it so that there's more authentic inclusion of all people. I think I'll stop there. I could talk forever, but I'll stop there.
Joanne, I do want to ask you a question before someone else jumps in. You made a correction. First you said racial minorities, and then you said racially minoritized, which is an important distinction. And can you give our audience a little bit more information about why you made that correction?
Yeah, I think that that's something that critical race theory helps me see, which is that minoritized really helps us understand that various racial groups are positioned by whiteness to be to play a particular role and be in a particular position in society. And so CRT helps me be able to remember that if I say minority as if it's some like normalized function, whereas it's really something that happens to people, if that makes sense.
It does. It puts the onus on the institution as opposed to the person. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who wants to answer that question? And let me know if you need me to repeat anything.
Shall I just speak? So as a Black woman, I would say Kimberly Crenshaw's introduction of intersectionality quite literally created a space in which my subject position can be seen and understood. And with regard to my work, I examine art and visual culture archives and the ways in which Black people are present and absent from them. So critical race theory gives me the tools to interrogate the racial logics that structure archives. And in effect, that gives me like a space to rethink and reorganize archival documents that in ways that allow materials and subjects of color to flourish outwardly. In other words, it gives me a means to see the complexities of Blackness while also giving me organizational tools.
Thank you, Elisa. Jeffrey, I saw you.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate being here. And I definitely agree with both panelists in terms of thinking about critical race theory as a way in which we see the world and a lens through which we see the world. I also like to offer a different take on critical race theory, though, that is centered in the experience of those who unfortunately are affected by anti-Blackness, racism, and racial antagonisms. One of the things that I like to point out to a lot of my friends and my students is, you know, our grandmothers and grandparents had some critical race theories. You know, I will never forget my grandmother telling stories about going down the street and knowing that she not only was going to be accosted, but her sons were going to be accosted, right? And the predictability of that was theoretical, right? It was made evident by the moment that they stepped out into the street and someone came up to them and said, "What are you doing here?" Or the police put up beside them, right? And my grandmother would tell these stories, and I always thought to myself that these are also moments of critical race theories, and particularly ones that taught me, right, what I had to look forward to in this world, right? And so it's not only just a way of seeing what it is that white folks can do or how they participate in anti-Blackness, it's also, for me, a way that explains what it is that Black folks and folks of color and, BIPOC folks, what we experience in this world.
So thank you, Jeffrey. Before we move on from you, I think that there's someone who's asking a question about, can you go into more detail about what anti-Blackness is?
Sure. I mean, anti-Blackness, right? When my grandmother was explaining, she understood what anti-Blackness was, which was this repeated, right, antagonism or acts of violence against Black folks for no other reason than being Black, right? And it's a historic production of violence that has its history connected to colonization, connected to slavery, right? And we can't disconnect it from patterns of violence that we learn. So for example, right, even the notion of the master that we talk about, right? We talk about the master and folks think we are far away from the master, but we still use narratives like, you have mastered a thing, right? We still say that is the master narrative, right? That these things still haunt us, right? The discourse of dominance and control over something, right, becomes a part of our vocabulary, which in effect, right, is the history, the long history of anti-Blackness. And so anti-Blackness is this repeated force of antagonisms against Black bodies and Black people.
Thank you so much for your answer. And so Anthony, we're going to take this question to you to close it up for this part.
No problem. The intersectionality of, my life as a multiracial individual, Puerto Rican, Polish, Rochester native, the lens of critical race theory, growing up in the community and thinking about how we interpret things, never really identifying it in that official term, right? Until my formal graduate work at the University of Rochester, and then really taking it to the next level as a formal educator, working in the community, but really looking and using that critical lens of how we understand ourselves, as Dr. McCune talked about, really bringing, I think, the fabric of our heritage and the fabric of our ethnicities and how we really look at things. Those are important. And now I see it more, interjecting now into the political space of my work, as well as the education space, being used both as a critical tool to help us understand where do we go from here, answering that critical question of how do we work together as a community, or how can the term be used as a sword to separate us? And I think that it's important to really look at how we're going to move forward and how we really look at the spaces that we're in, but really understanding what it's there for. It's, not being a sword against, but being as a way to check ourselves to ensure that are we answering the equality, the equity questions, and are we really looking to come together as a community? And so all of those play together in how I work in the community, how we work together as individuals, how we work together as academics and educators in pushing that narrative forward.
Thank you. So I'm listening to the conversation already. We've talked about education, we talked about history, we talked about the community, we've talked about art. And the thing I'm particularly connected to is this insertion of our grandmothers and understanding that even though there was not a named theory, that these lives are happening and creating what we have pulled from this body of knowledge, right? And so when we have someone like Kimberly Crenshaw, who you mentioned, Elisa, we can see that if we go far enough back, that our grandmothers and our grandmothers and our grandmothers and them are the first, proponents or creators or curators of what we know as CRT. So thinking about the connections that we bring between CRT and our full selves, what do you think are some of the misconceptions that you've heard either in your private spaces, your public spaces, and of course in the national media? And anyone can start that question. What are misconceptions that you've heard about CRT?
I could start. I think there are a lot. The one I thought of first is that it's about teaching white children to hate themselves. And I think this couldn't be further than the truth. And I think the implications of this kind of misconception is that it once again positions critical race theory, people of color as a problem, or as it enables, it's kind of gaslighting, really. It enables people to turn it back around and perpetuate the anti-Blackness that Dr. McCune was talking about. We'll talk later about things people can do to counter this, but I feel like that and it's a takeover, that socialist takeover, lots of misconceptions, but there's that one. What I hear most, is that it's about, I should hate myself and feel guilty and bad because I'm white, and it really misses the entire point about it being a theoretical lens to understand systems and how they oppress.
Yeah, I really agree with that. That was what I was going to say, but I also want to add to that. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is when people say that our children are learning critical race theory, period. Right? Like as if that's really possible in terms of, like, I think about my son's school, people asking, do you teach critical race theory here? And he's in first grade. I teach him critical race theory, right? But not the one that they're thinking of, right? They're like, does he teach, are they teaching white kids to hate themselves, as Dr. Larson said, as Joanne said, and part of what I think the other piece that is missing, or that I hear people say, is that it's teaching folks to think that Black people are better than white people, right? That it's a organization of the hierarchies that we know have historically been in this country, which is that white people are better than Black people. And it's like some kind of reverse, right? When in fact, I think a better way to say it is that CRT in its best form, right, is teaching folks to hate anti-Blackness, right? And it's teaching folks to hate the whiteness that shows up every day doing violence against those who are not like themselves, right? And if that's what my son's kids are learning and my son and his friends are learning, then I'm all about CRT, right? Like, and I think that's what CRT actually is, right? And so in some ways, we should be advocating for the implementation of that type of CRT, even though we know it's not the original theory, the legal theory, right, which cannot be taught to kindergartners and first graders. But there is an idea of CRT that has become a common sense knowledge, right? A kind of secondhand or quick hand or like a community version of CRT, which is just a real critique of inequality in our society and an explanation for how inequality works within our communities.
Thank you. So if it's true, then this is just a way to examine systemic inequalities and historical oppressions. Anthony, I'm going to start with you. Why do you think that we're hearing about critical race theory now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that really delves into the political world. And back in March of this year, you really saw this as a hot button issue, kind of bubbling up. A lot of folks not paying attention right before the school board elections in May. And so what James Carville coined the term, it's the economy stupid, right? In politics, you find the lowest common denominator to make things simple and to make things buzzwords and to get folks really rankus and getting out of their seats. And so, a Manhattan Institute strategist, Christopher Rufo, posted on Twitter that they were going to make CRT along with Steve Bannon, that they were going to make CRT the buzzword, critical race theory the buzzword, that anytime you heard that, it was going to be an adversarial term. It was going to proliferate an idea of separatization and hate, so that you really antagonized a group of voting bloc to get out and vote. And so what we saw is that where critical race theory had not been mentioned anytime in the national press, within a 2-month span, we saw it highlighted over 1,300 times across different news stations and articles. And so what has happened is that the term has become politicized to the nth degree, and it really has become the main weapon for the upcoming midterm elections in the political spaces. The idea is to get folks out and vote for different ideologies and different groupings. I would say, depending on who you ask, the intended or unintended consequences of it is that our educators and our schools have become the foundation of political turf wars and warfares, where we're seeing them play out in school districts and school meetings, where folks are now finding themselves having to defend CRT and critical race theory, and defend what they're doing. And what has happened is that we've really encapsulated CRT, and now the misinterpretation, the misdefinition of it has now become that critical race theory is diversity, equity work. It is not. That it is somehow teaching our white students to hate themselves. It is not. Those are none of those things, but those are ways to really placate on individuals' fears. And so we find this political strategy now engulfing the nation as we're moving to the next step and being used as a pretty significant weapon if individuals don't really come up and talk about it and really unpack what it is.
So this fear and this lack of ignorance and this racial boogeyman who's saying that white kids are no good or white people are bad is now stoking these fears. Is there anyone else who would like to talk about why we're just hearing it? Anthony, that was a wonderful, very thorough response, but I'm not sure if anyone else wants to chime in. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the next question. Elisa, we're going to start with you for this. Now, I want to tell the audience that when I was reading the bios, everybody has such an impressive CV. It was just very interesting to see an artist brought into the conversation, because those of us in the academy know how we can see these conversations happen across many disciplines. But for, an everyday conversation, to have an artist come in and share the way that you present this topic is something that's I think, very unique and special to this panel. So Elisa, again, for you, as an artist and someone who has taught about Black identity, one of the tenets of CRT is counter storytelling. Can you talk a bit about what this is, and in what ways or mediums have you found most useful in understanding the social construction of race?
Firstly, thank you for your kind words, Takia, and certainly I can. So I'm a historian of photography, a photographer, and a scholar of Black studies. And while at some point in my life I may have thought of those as all sort of just coincidental facts about myself, I now believe that Black people really do have a very special relationship to photography. So for that reason, I would say that it is the most useful medium for understanding the social construction of race. And I'm going to share my screen now, just to sort of explain why I think that. Wait a sec.
While Elisa is sharing her screen, I just encourage everybody again to look down into the chat box and to review the critical race theory, the tenets, and in that way you can be more familiarized. Okay, Elisa, back to you.
Thank you. So we all know Frederick Douglass for his work as an abolitionist, but he was also an advocate for the use of photography. In fact, he was the most photographed man or person of the 19th century. So his advocacy grew out of this discontentment with white artists, failure to create impartial portraits of Black people. Black people were typically drawn with exaggerated features, and those served to create and sustain racist stereotypes. Early photography simply didn't allow for that sort of exaggeration. So here we see Douglass with a pensive gaze, well-dressed. He's a direct reflection of what was before the lens. Excuse me. He could be sure that whatever he put for the photographer would be precisely what would be captured. However, when the subject of an image is not in control of their image, there are cases where photography is still pretty dangerous. And that's highlighted by this piece by image maker Carrie Mae Weems. So Weems used an image of an enslaved woman named Delia that was created in 1850 by J.T. Zealy in service of racist pseudoscientific practices. And this is an example of a contemporary artist using critical race theory to understand the transformation of the subject before the lens, and also its dangerous implications. So you became a scientific profile. It's that message of what becomes of Delia when she's photographed by J.T. Zealy. Here are two other examples I wanted to bring in. On the left is a photograph by Dawood Bey. And in making this image, he used a special sort of kind of film that created both an instant print, which he would give to the sitters, this couple here on the left, and also a negative that the photographer could use to print more copies of the image later in the darkroom. So with the instant print, his sitters could respond to their image moments after it was made. And what I think is really powerful about this practice is how it brings the sitters into the process of creating a portrait, their portrait, and determining where it will be seen. So whether they stick it up in the home or share it with their friends, just having agency there in terms of what their image is going to do. On the right is an image from Tyler Mitchell's series, I Can Make You Feel Good. And the goal behind that project was to create visually a Black utopia. So he envisions Black people in these beautifully colored images, just having fun and just having a good time. Now, finally, I'm glad that Dr. McKeown brought up thinking about our grandmothers and their own theories. So I think no discussion of photography is complete without recognition of family photographs and the things that we have at home, the images that we have at home. So perhaps everybody interacts with images of this kind throughout their lives, but I think that what is unique to Black folks is the stark contrast between what we see in photographs in the home versus those that are in the public sphere. So I'll end with this image of my great-grandparents in an Alabama photo studio to encourage folks to think about how their own constructions of race are rooted in the home. I'm back.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it's so important to highlight that counter storytelling. I just appreciate you showing some Black joy, because so often these conversations are very heavy. And when we leave these spaces, we end up needing, like, I call like a cleanse. You got to go like to the Men in Black and get zapped. And so to see this image of, you know, Black beauty and showing that in order to have this countering, it's not a negative, it's something that is beautiful and powerful. And so we see that on the page, and now we have your work to share those images. And so thank you so much for that. And that leads us to our next question. For all the panelists, when we're thinking about educators or anyone who's in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space, and I'm paying particular close attention to what Anthony said, that CRT is not DEI, right? But paying attention to people who sort of been lumped into everything, right? What guidance would you give educators or anyone interested in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space who wants to use critical race theory and anti-racism? How would you tell them to do that effectively and equitably?
I had some thinking about this, and I also noticed a question in the chat about the new New York State culturally responsive and sustaining curriculum. I think very at a base level, accurate history. So to go beyond what might be a state-sponsored curriculum, especially given Anthony's point about the way school boards are getting taken over and kinds of different curricula, different states who are eliminating key, like, human beings in the narrative history, looking like accurate history, that it goes to Elisa's points about counter storytelling as a tenet, in the sense that there's the, classical marginalizing historical narrative in the United States, and then you bring in some accurate stuff, like, here's actually what happened, or you didn't talk about this, like, who's missing, asking questions like that, and really also building on Anthony's point about I find that framework fairly positive. But one thing that Gloria Ladson-Billings, who brought critical race, her and her colleague William Tate brought critical race theory to education. A culturally relevant, responsive education is not critical race theory, like Anthony suggested. You can be culturally responsive and not understand or use critical race theory, and vice versa. I think using critical race theory with that framework then brings in accurate history, and not just re-othering in the sense of, like, stopping at representation. We're just going to add a book that has a Black character in it, rather than understanding how publishing, authorship, American literature has then systematically positioned Black characters in certain ways, not others. That I would say focus on trying to be accurate would be a simple one.
I want to underscore that and uplift that, because that accuracy, and so everybody is an expert now with the capital CRT, the lowercase CRT, IDA, EDI, MJS, like whatever, like, people are just, the alphabet soup of it all. And I think that there's a sort of like a pushback against academicians and say, oh, well, you all want to be so highbrow, but that historical accuracy is something that anybody who enters into this has to absolutely be mindful of, right? And so, Jeffrey, I see you nodding your head, so let's do this like double dutch and just jump on in, right?
I'm really getting into this conversation, and one of the things that I just think is also missing in the conversation around critical race theory is the way in which critical race theory also introduced us to a notion of intersectionality, right? And part of what I think so often happens is we think critical race theory is about the race man, right? Or it's just around Black people as a blanket idea. When in fact, right, one of the things that was really important about critical race theory is it introduced us to the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class, and that those things in collision actually make us most vulnerable, right, for death, right? And for violence, right? And so part of what I think is really, really important as we teach the history in our accuracy is realizing also that there was a different kind of treatment given to Black women, right? There was a different type of treatment that was given to Black queer or Black trans women, right? There's a different type of treatment, and there's something that happens in regards to race, but it's when race meets other categories, right? That it just animates and amplifies, right, the violence. And then the last thing I would say about that I really think about accuracy when we're talking about accuracy, because we like to teach about Black people, right? As if Black people are all the same, having the same experience, and we like have Black History Month, and we act like every person had the access to being a famous icon, right? But I'm like, you're gonna teach, the icons. Why don't you teach the non-iconic, right? Why don't you teach, the stories in the newspaper and pull out the little young boy who decided that won the spelling bee in Birmingham, Alabama, or the trans girl who wrote her first book and published it independently, right? Like, these are the stories that we have to tell. And so I really appreciate Joanne inviting us to think more about accuracy and really being specific in our assessments and analyses.
I just want to amplify a comment in the Q&A that disability can and should also be invoked when we talk about intersectionality of identities, and it is the one that is most often not mentioned. So absolutely want to center that conversation and make sure that people understand that intersectionalities happen in many spaces. So thank you so much for the comment.
Can I just, I'm going to jump in listening to Dr. Larson and Dr. McKeon's comments. I certainly think accuracy is really important in teaching. And also sort of in thinking of my own guidance that I would give to educators who are dedicated to anti-racism, I would say when making your syllabi, don't just block off a day or a week or even just a section to think about people of color, but rather think about people of color as always there. We always have been, we always will be, like ever present throughout. So in every section that you're teaching, think about or locate where people of color are and then talk about them. So I think breaking out of that, like, here's our race week sort of framework gives us a space for more nuance, like Dr. McKeon is talking about. We can't talk about the non-icons if we only have a day, like we need a lot more time. So keep it throughout the whole semester, the whole year, if it's a year-long course, whatever you've got, keep going with it.
Absolutely. To kind of go off the back of that, I would say too is educators out there, don't be brave and don't let the fear censor you or stop you from knowing your craft. I think one of the things that I respect most of the educators who have been my true heroes growing up and those that I work with and work for day in and day out is that you are the authorities, you are the pros in your room, and you also know the value that your students bring to the table. And we can't let outside entities politicize our classrooms, where the fact that we're afraid to teach the true history and honest history of our country, as complicated and as painful as it is. And so in really challenging that, I also have seen a lot of profiles and courage from superintendents, from school board members, from educators who are standing up and creating these spaces where they're having critical conversations about what is going on and teaching folks. And in most instances, when parents have these questions, when parents are pushing forward narratives that they're just handed and they're confused and they're worried, once that conversation happens, the walls come down. And that's where the true educational spaces and learning environments and, informal environments happen. And we're still a community and still push forward. Yes, we're in a scary space right now in terms of the complications, and it's very adversarial and tenuous. But at the same time, there is room for growth, and there is a better side to this part. So be brave, be able to stand up for what you're doing in your craft. You're good at it, and we need you.
So Anthony,
I also add one thing.
Ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just want to. I want to add to that brilliant statement by Anthony, just to say one little thing, and that is, we also don't have to teach CRT, right? Because ultimately, from the beginning of this conversation, we've been saying you're actually not teaching CRT, right? And so it actually might be in our best interest not to name it unless that's really, really what you're doing, but not to name it, but to do these things, incorporate, right? Make sure that we're really accounting for multiple intersections, including disability, right? Doing the work. I think that is really key, and never forgetting that there's a reason why one of the best forms of pedagogy by Black people was the Underground Railroad, right? There's a reason, right? That is one of the nation's greatest technologies towards freedom. And that is not because it was explicit and it was out there and everybody was putting out their chest. I want to show you that I'm doing X, Y, and Z, but it was about the Freedom Project, right? And so if the Freedom Project is real for you, do the work.
I wanted to add, Alyssa made a comment, made me remember this idea of even those of us in higher ed, this concept of decolonizing your syllabus. And what that means is I think we have, to take the effort to look beyond traditional white researchers, white academics, if it's a graduate class or any kind of class that you're teaching, to look for who are the authors of color, the scholars of color, artists of color who have done this work for many, many years. It's not like they're all new. And honor that work and bring that work into the conversation in any higher education space. But also, I mentioned this before when we were getting ready for this, that it's not about, and I think it goes back to that misconception, it's not about teaching critical race theory. We use critical race theory to understand something. So this idea of decolonize your syllabus is using critical race theory to look at how an artifact like a syllabus might be perpetuating, anti-racism or sexism or ableism or any of these ways in which we oppress. To go with Anthony, be brave. Don't continue the reoppression. Take a look at what you're doing and make those changes. And critical race theory is a useful lens to use in order to understand how to do that.
So we're not teaching, we're using and applying. And so for the audience, I just want you to make sure that you're keeping up with all of this wonderful wealth of information. So some of the things that have been suggested for those of you who are interested in understanding how you can apply or use critical race theory, we talked about exploring, the objects around you. We have Elisa showing her great-grandparents' photographs. We have Jeffrey talking about the Underground Railroad and how it was the creation of this technology and understanding Black communities, understanding the ways that Black people disrupt systems. We're also hearing some conversation, of course, about historical accuracy and using artists of color. You don't have to try to stand in and try to speak for other people. You can actually go and find people who are doing the things that you want to tell. Too many people are trying to be experts, and you cannot pick up all of this knowledge overnight. So go find these artists and see what they're doing, these scholars, and use this decades-long work that has already been created, as well as what is currently being created. I want to take a question from the chat because I think it's important. Anthony, you started talking about being brave, and other panelists sort of pulled that thread. And we know that there's a very real cost for people who push back against these systems, right? And so the question in the chat is, how do we protect and support persons who push against the current negative political narrative of CRT? Because there's a cost.
Absolutely. And I think that's where you have to lean on your spaces and those that support you, and really challenge. We have to challenge our school districts, and we have to challenge the leadership and administration within there to really stand up for what space there is. I do often joke too. It's interesting that you have these novices who are coming into the educational space and saying that, CRT is taught here, CRT is taught here. Between the Common Core and the regions, you tell me where there's space to add CRT for some of our educators, and they would, and they would actually respond back. But I think the part where I see that the when I talked about being brave and the profiles and courage, is really seeing a lot of educator groups coming together, having critical conversations with themselves in groups, having those conversations with parents. You know, you can't be afraid of hard conversations, because the other part is before we got here. I think what a big backlash to why CRT is being used as the focal point is that a lot of these conversations were starting to happen. They were starting to challenge the status quo within districts where normally you may not have seen that. And so you had educators talking amongst themselves, learning, implicit bias training, growing in folks really trying to educate themselves on where their limitations are and where their balances are. And so for those individuals, it's finding that craft, finding that benefit. You know, and even in our area, you know, I am someone who, if an educator is in those spaces and they have those questions, I myself am a resource and I'm willing to sit down and have sat down with others to talk about ways on where we can support each other and support our community. And then the other thing I would say out there is for those who are interested in the area to really challenge those who are coming at school boards and coming at communities with this is run for office, change the narrative, take on that mantle of leadership. And that's where another space where we can be helpful. And, you know, I'm always willing and able and trying to find great talent to run for office. And so finding those brave souls to get out there, let's win and take back our community.
So we'll make sure that folks have Anthony's contact information so that we can get you on the ballot in the next election. This is the election season, so we want to make sure that we are also encouraging people to get to the polls. So Anthony, now do not try to block folks and do not try to change your number now that you'll be getting all these people running to you to run for the polls. So Anthony, you started this conversation talking about, you know, elections and political spaces, and this is something that we sort of can move through this group conversation. When we think about politics and we think about communities, how do we think that there is a correlation about learning about racism and race in schools having to do with being politically aware and also being community engaged? Like, how does that knowledge of one thing in one space sort of feed out into other spaces?
You know, it is difficult. I'll actually put out an example. Assemblymember Damon Meeks in the local area. One of the things that he did is he teamed up with Assemblymember Harry Bronson, and they brought all of the candidates who were running for office, and got Reverend Myra Brown together, and they went through an implicit bias training just running for office. And so that was unheard of. Nobody had ever done that before, and really sat down and really had a conversation about the narrative being used in political spaces. That's unfortunately the exception. It's not the rule. And so I think when you are often in I would say an egotistical space or a centered space where you have to talk about yourself, a lot of folks who run for office, they don't realize how much they have to talk about themselves and get in those spaces. You really are put in vulnerable positions on making sure that you're out there, making sure that you're communicating what your value statements are and what you stand for. I think one of the most provocative and critical conversations that I had ever heard in speeches was Barack Obama's speech on race when he ran. And he was not someone who was a willing participant, I think, to have to engage in that space during that time in a presidential election, but he was made to, but he rose to that moment. And so I think that our leaders in the future, no matter what your political party and affiliation is, and most people don't realize is that school board elections are unaffiliated. It's nonpartisan. You're running as a person. You really have to look at what your value system is and what you stand in and being your foundation, and then also being able to admit when you are maybe wrong about where you're standing and where that standpoint is. And I think that those are important to really kind of check yourself and having those conversations, being in those communities and environments, and being also able to engage with communities you may never have engaged with before. We have often, individuals who run for office and they haven't been to certain parts of town or certain communities, and it really forces those interactions. And I think it challenges those. If you want to lead the people, you have to go to the people. And I think those are important training grounds. Those are important intersections within the political space and the community space where they can be helpful.
Oh, okay, Jeffrey, I thought you had unmuted yourself. I want to throw the question to Elisa because I'm going to just reword it just a little bit. How do you think of learning about race and racism has to do with someone becoming more artistically engaged?
Well, how do I think learning about race and racism has to do with someone becoming more artistically engaged? I'd say, because I think of art as often a form of expression, if you are expressing yourself, it's helpful to know who you are and understand your position in this world, and also the positions of those around you. So like, in order to make art that people, that will do something for you in terms of effectively expressing yourself, but also in terms of making art that might connect with other people, I think it's important to learn about your racial identity.
So building those connections between communities, which is very important. Thank you. And that leads us to our next question. And Joanne, I'm going to ask you to answer this first. Anyone else can join and answer that. But earlier you talked about how white people feel like they're being demonized and they're really afraid that, you know, some power is going to be taken away. But how does utilizing critical race theory benefit and empower not only students of color, but also white students?
It's a great question, and I have dealt with some of this in terms of some of the courses that I teach at the Warner School. I think understanding how, for white students to understand how the various systems that we've talked about have positioned whiteness against Blackness, and and I use those words very carefully because, like, going back to the, you know, teaching white kids to hate themselves, this isn't about that. It's about whiteness as an ideology, and understanding the role that these systems have played in producing their own privilege, and then giving them an opportunity to understand what they may or may not want to do about that, including getting out of the way if that needs to be something they need to do, but just really understanding society broadly, and how all of these systems that are constructed have really hurt many people, and, you know, how they want to then position themselves within those systems to make those changes. And a couple of comments in the chat have talked about Derek Bell saying, you know, whiteness will never give up power. And I guess I have hope naively, but I think if we move away from white people to understand whiteness and to think about power not as a thing, but as a relationship, if we can move to more equitable relationships in the construction and of our society and our systems, then there are more voices making decisions and being a part of conversations, working with and alongside each other instead of against. I think when white students can have an opportunity to understand that, see that, which often, given the current education system, are never taught this, never understood how power works and how endemic racism works in this country. Being able to learn that, I mean, I think accurate history needs to be taught to everybody, and how these systems work, everybody should know. So we have a democratically engaged and humane society.
Yeah, I really like that you addressed that question. I really wanted to, you know, the question was, you know, if we take Derek Bell's supposition or argument that racism and bigotry is never going to die, then what is the utility of CRT, right? And my first response was, right, sure, racism and bigotry may never die, but you don't have to be the key subscriber to it, right? Like just because it's never going to die doesn't mean like you have to participate, right? And so part of what I think the incentive has to be for our, particularly as we raise our kids, as we want to live in a more humane world, as Joanne said, is that we have to desire, right, to make better the world and not be key subscribers to anti-Blackness, not to engage in this kind of ready-made machine of racism that has become a part of the American soul and fiber, right? That we have to reject it, right? And so part of what this requires is a rejection of racism and bigotry as the core tenets of whiteness, right? What does whiteness become if in fact we begin to think of ourselves as being liberators and abolitionists, right? If white people think of themselves as liberators and abolitionists before they think of themselves as Karens, surveyors of the world, right? Proprietors, owners, masters, right? Then we have a better world when they don't think of themselves that way. And so for me, it's not a question of, is CRT going to give us the utopic society that we need? No, it's not. But we have the opportunity to kind of chip at this old rock that we call bigotry and racism.
So it's the continual understanding that we'll have to do the work and not just expecting it to be solved overnight. Go ahead, Anthony.
And I was just going to point out real quick is that I think the fact that we're even looking at Bell's critique and also Elisa's point out of Kimberly Crenshaw and others is the fact it just showed this is a perfect example of why critical race theory is a theory to be challenged, to be thought through, to be unpacked, and not something you taught in schools, because even those who are scholars in the area are fighting over what its true purpose and meaning, or do we get to that utopia of what we're expecting? And I just thought this was a perfect example of that.
And it's to expect that utopia, wanting CRT to be the magic pill. Is it wanting it to do too much, or does it take the responsibility off of us as a society to work harder to chip away at that rock of bigotry? Or do we just say, oh, got my CRT pill, I'm all set, So how do we really effectively engage with this process of dismantling racism and dismantling whiteness? And I love that Joanne brought that up. It's something I talk about all the time. White people will say, oh, I'm a white person. It's like, okay, we're not talking about one white person. We're talking about this system, and being able to dismantle this system, right? So I'm just an everyday person. Tell me, how can I incorporate this into my life? Like, what can I do? I'm just a lay person in the streets.
One thing I thought of, there's a couple of people asking about resources in terms of Dr. McHugh's point about the evolution of the theory, right? It's a theory. Or no, I'm sorry, Anthony, that was you. There are, Brian Brayboy has taken this work to the Native American scholarly community to talk about what they call native crit. Delgado, Gaitan, and Solorzano have taken it to Latinx communities, so that it's not just one, it's constantly evolving in a way that, so Native Americans have a different way to think about the 5 tenets and have added some, right? So I think, I forget why that related to your question, Takia, I'm sorry, but the idea of the everyday person, I think one thing would be to maybe do some reading and investigate for yourself and understand this is a theoretical framework that's constantly being updated and changed and brought in, like the comment made earlier about remember disability, all the ways that intersectionality really is a useful tool to start to see how things work in the world.
I want to address this because I think this is actually the core of a problem, right? And I figured that I might be a little bit sound a little contentious in my reflection here, but the question in the Q&A helped me not to sound contentious or necessarily play into some of the hype around the angry Black man speaking at this moment, right? I'm never angry, but anyway, part of what I wanted to get at was this question that is asked here about what I wonder is Bell saying that there's a trait unique to whites that they won't give up power? And I want to really interrogate what that question really means. I mean, Toni Morrison would say it this way. She would say, if you are born into a society that grants you privileges from the door, right? that tethers something to you, that tethers power to you, right? Is it a biologically unique trait? No. Is it sociological, cultural? Yes. But here's the thing. There are also some traits of anti-Blackness that were born with me, right? And I struggle with those every day, right? And critical race theory helps me make sense of why it is that I'm struggling with thinking about my hair. Why am I struggling thinking about my skin? Why am I struggling thinking about you? Right? Like that is really what critical race theory offers us. But I also want to add one last thing, and that is critical race theories. There's not one, right? And that's part of why the political right gets away with, being a scapegoat, is because it pronounces itself as one thing, right? That it's only about, whenever you say race, you're kind of like wink, wink, nod, nod, hate white people. No. If you say theories, then we're talking about the theories that also include sexuality, right? Black queer studies is a critical race theory, right? A whole field of study. Black trans studies is a part of the critical race theories, right? And so we go on and on and on. So my thing is, how can we better address the everyday person? We can encourage the everyday person to actually take very seriously what it means to come into the world, quote unquote, as you are.
Listen, we about to pass this collection plate around. You started going in with the repetition and the rhetoric. I'm like, yes, yes. But I think it's important that you as a Black man talk about, anti-Blackness and how we're all raised up in this society that positions one set of persons as, even when you said, I'm not angry. And I always go to my Solange, for those of you who are familiar. She says, I got a lot to be mad about. And it's like, I am an angry Black woman. When I get mad, I get mad. And because of these stereotypes and the oppressive ideologies and caricatures and shaping, it says, oh, you can't be an angry Black woman. Well, absolutely I can. And absolutely so can Jeffrey. He can be an angry Black man. And so we're saying that critical race theory, what I'm hearing the panelists say, is that it's expansive, not exclusive. Like it's a way to open up understanding and open up ways of dialogue and open up ways to build community. And when we think of building community, particularly in this time, we think about the ways that communities are shaped by politicians and politics. So I'm going to ask Anthony this question. And as y'all can tell, we're already jumping into the Q&A. We're going back and forth with our prescribed questions. So here we are. Anthony, I'm going to start this question with you. How do we support school leaders, politicians, community partners, and others who are navigating CRT questions and debate? Because you mentioned you wanted people to run, but we don't need more people running doing the wrong thing. So we want to give them, the ways that we as a community can support school leaders, politicians, community partners, and others who are navigating CRT questions and debate.
Absolutely. I mentioned earlier about the space that Assemblymember Demond Meeks created. I think we have to create more spaces like that. That they don't have to be formal spaces, but having these conversations in the community, interacting and discussing with dialogue, actually going to school board meetings and having the counter narrative come up, talking about the support of what schools may or may not be doing, and having the other side of the conversation come up there. Right now we have a lot of tension and a lot of anger, and not a lot of information and not being informative. And so creating those spaces is important, and having conversations in the community that are connected and engaging with individuals we haven't spoke to before, engaging with communities that we may or may not have, whether engaged with them, whether it be out of unknown or fear. I think those are the important avenues we have to create amongst ourselves within the community to have those spaces. And this conversation is part of that today. As we push forward in recruiting individuals who are interested in doing this work, and really uplifting those voices in this space as well.
Thank you. I'm looking around before I sort of pivot to the next question. There's a question in the chat. There's two questions. One is about healing and one is about language. And the full statement is the role of language, our everyday speech, in reinforcing anti-Blackness came up in the discussion of the uses of the word master. There are so many other colloquial and metaphorical linguistic practices that are racist. Does the panel think it's important to be more conscious of them and try to avoid them? So I'm gonna say yes. I'm just gonna answer that question for the panel. But what I'm gonna ask, what I'm gonna pivot into, because I thought it was important to bring, I love language, I'm an English professor. But when we think about the ways that things are described, like one of the quotes I use often is, your response to something is based on how you describe it. And we had that master conversation, and we were talking about anti. And so whenever people hear anti-Blackness, they don't know, wait, am I supposed to be for it or against it? So what is the role of language in thinking about CRT in the ways that we explain it to people, in the ways that we expand the theories, love theories of CRT? So the role of language.
For me, it's absolutely critical. I think my correction that you pointed out earlier from saying minority to minoritized would be one example to the person in terms of the everyday. Be aware and conscious of how you use language and what you say. I'm currently trying to stop saying, hi guys, trying to just to constantly be reflective. Angela Davis, who's one of my heroes, and I heard speak at UCLA back when I was an undergraduate, said you have to bring it up every single time. Am I great at it? No, but I do tend to be the person who'll go, excuse me, did you realize that's a racist term? Or did you, sometimes I'm calm and diplomatic, and sometimes I'm not. But to challenge, bring up, point to, I think what's the saying? Sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will, words do hurt, and it's very important that you're careful and be reflective about how you use language.
Yeah, I think you're right. And even like, the most basic things like keep it simple, stupid, what we learned in our first year English, right? Sets in place an expectation that the academic discourse is going to keep things simple. So then when my students come to my class and we're talking about the layered complexities of race, right? They're like, wait a minute. I thought it was keep it simple, stupid. Like, let's keep it easy. It's supposed to be, what do you mean I have to understand the economic deprivation that exists within Black communities to understand maternal order and all this other stuff? What do you mean that in order to understand Black sexuality, I have to understand about slavery and representations in the 1940s and 1920s, right? What do you mean? Like all of these things, right? And I'm like, no. I'm not easy, and neither is the history of Black people. Right. And so we have to get past this notion that, and that's actually what critical race theory discourse, I would agree with Anthony here, right? The critical race theory discourse is so problematic because society wants to be easy, right? And that's why it's an anti-intellectual society, right? The great John Dewey once said that we are an uninformed public, right? And I think that we are an uninformed public, and we're an anti-intellectual public that does not want to talk about the complexities of our social circumstances. So that's how I respond to that too. Sorry.
Proudly uninformed in some cases, like, oh, I'm proud to be ignorant and not know. Would anybody else like to join? Thank you all. Would anybody else like to join in on that answer? We're all set.
I would say, talk about complicated existences and even just the fabric of my own life, right? We've talked in many different iterations without saying it, but colorism, right? I am Polish, I am Caucasian, and I am Latino, but I also benefit from white privilege. And so understanding that and hearing that, and to say that I have had a leg up, right? To say that I have, growing up in the streets of Rochester, right? I look back and look at all the, misogynistic and homophobic terms we use just flippantly as kids because we didn't know any better, right? Does it make it less wrong? No, it doesn't, right? But facing those past wrongs or injustices, whether intentionality is there or not, it's hard. And so when we talk about facing, there's a level, and in the chat they talked about defensiveness, and I think we have to get past that defensiveness to understand that it doesn't paint the fabric and the whole brush of who we are. But in order to get better and in order to understand who we are, we have to learn from both our benefits and positives and as well as our mistakes. And I think having that conversation, having that critical consciousness within ourselves to face that is important. And we don't get to the spaces where we're debating critical race theory until we have that foundational aha moment or even willingness to engage with it.
I think that you have begun answering the question in the chat. Someone wanted to know, what is whiteness as property, which is also one of the tenets of critical race theory. So we can just bottom line that, touching on what Anthony has already offered would be helpful for our audience. What is whiteness as property? That's the question. I'm looking at Joanne smiling. Okay, go ahead, Anthony.
No. I didn't know if you were directing to me. I will turn it over to Dr.
Well, I mean, I can only explain how I understand that as a principle in critical race theory, which is really seeing, and I'm going to echo Gloria Ladson-Billings' work in the sense of understanding the role property plays in society, and whiteness is a property that has a lot of capital and a lot of use to maintain and perpetuate the status quo in terms of power relations. I think that's probably a naive interpretation, and I would defer to Jeffrey or Lisa for a more in-depth definition.
I would think of it sort of as what Dr. Meehan was speaking about earlier, in terms of like what is tethered to you as you enter a space. So understanding whiteness as property is meaning a sense of privilege, or like what sort of leg up you may have when you enter a space. The same way owning any other type of property adds some kind of value to you, or to like what worth you have in a variety of terms. That's sort of how I would think about whiteness as property.
And I think Jeffrey mentioned this earlier too, thank you, that this social construction of value, like I can't just say, like, I can't pass for white, like I can't just go in society, like, you know what, I'm white today. So now I have some, social capital with whiteness. It's something that other people ascribe. So Anthony, I love names that sound exactly like the person's representation. So Plonzinski, Figueroa, it's like you get to see all of my stuff. So if you thought this was just a white man walking in here, there's something else to the mix. And so it's that social construction of what we value when we think about whiteness, and what can we get, and what can be commodified or traded, or what is perceived as being greater in all of these spaces. So thank you all. Can I say something? It is, believe it or not, we are coming up on our time for the evening. I know the conversation, someone in the chat, and I want to say this out loud, someone said that we should take this show on the road. So we're going to have to get t-shirts and then, we can just go around talking about CRT on a Tuesday night. So since it is towards the end of our chat, I want to ask you all one final question. It's for each of you. What is one suggestion or tool that you use that our audience members can also put in their toolbox when confronting opposition and misconceptions of critical race theory? And we're going to end with Jeffrey on this, but I want you all to tell us again, what is one suggestion or tool that you use that our audience members can also put in their toolbox when confronting oppression or opposition, rather, and misconceptions of critical race theory?
It's hard to think of a single tool, and I can think of, in terms of my teaching and perhaps other educators out there, and I don't want to impinge on Alyssa's answer, but I use a lot of visuals. There are some excellent films and artists who have, like the ones that she shared, where it just helps somebody see differently. So reading and talking about is one thing, but there's also kind of, as she mentioned, the expression of the artist, the ways in which another human being sees the world that you might then experience through that image, or film or video, spoken word poetry, some other things that change the way somebody understands relationships, specifically around race and any of the other intersectional identities we've talked about, has been very useful for me in my teaching, and also in my research, in terms of how I would then write about and represent the communities with whom I work, including having them be, authors on pieces.
You've also mentioned Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings a lot too, so that's a resource. So Elisa, since your name was brought up and we're talking about visual, let's pivot to you next, and you can tell us about yourself.
Certainly using plenty of images is what I do, largely because I study images, but I think that everybody can benefit from incorporating them into their teaching and thinking about critical race theory. I was sort of thinking about this with the question about language, and just how sharpening your sort of like critical consciousness or understanding of language, whether it be actual words or a visual language, but really seeing what's at hand, again, a visual or actual words, and questioning, like, for yourself, like, can you accept what's before you? And whether you can or can't, I think taking the next step to unpack why. So understanding how what you see connects to who you are, and sort of what you envision for the world. And I don't mean to sound so or to speak so broadly, but I guess what I'm getting at is, if there's something in an image or about a word or a certain label that doesn't sit right with you, doing the work to understand why it doesn't sit right with you, and then talking about it, shining a light on what's wrong with it or what you see is maybe right with it. But yeah, just the sort of tool I would use is just maintaining that critical eye. Yeah.
Thank you. Anthony?
Yeah, I was thinking about, and I think reflection comes to mind the most in terms of really standing back and reflecting on what you're hearing, and hearing the words and hearing the experience of the individuals who you're engaging with and connecting to. I was recently just introduced to Heather McGee's work, The Sum of Us, as well. And I think that there was that 2016 moment on C-SPAN where she engaged with a caller who was having this moment of trying to confront their whiteness or confront their prejudice and their experiences, and really dissecting and walking through that. And so one of the things I would say is look up that moment. It was a very powerful moment, I think, in this work and in this space. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up a tool that we've used in a lot of our inclusive research environments trainings and work that I've done at the University of Rochester through my work with the Kern Center, and learning from my colleagues there, and the idea of the broken toe analogy. We talk about it all the time. And it goes that, say that in haste, I go to the bathroom and I step on your foot and I break your toe. Your toe is broken, whether I intended it or not. And what I need to do is attend to that first and foremost before I get into any explanations. Let me just think about how ludicrous that would be, that I've broken your toe and I'm taking the time to explain to you how it was not intentional, and that I've never done this before, because what I imagine is that what you'd be most concerned about is getting your toe attended to. And this whole piece about I didn't mean to is not attending to you, it's attending to me. And I think that really speaks to the idea of reflection and attending to that, attending to the harm, attending to the person, and attending to what's in front of us, whether we were the creator of that harm or not, and working together as a community.
That was great. And it just shows that CRT has tools for everybody, right? And one of the things that I want to say is believing that there are tools for everybody in this, right? There are tools for white folks who really need to understand, right, the history of anti-Blackness and white racism, the way in which it works, the way in which we have come into this world learning certain things that we didn't know we were even learning, and then we learn them and realize, oh my God, I'm a little racist, right? Like I have problematic ways of seeing people, right? For Black folks, right, critical race theory has helped us to see our blind spots, right? The lack of discussion around different abilities and disabilities, right? The lack of discussion around sexualities, the lack of discussion around trans folk, the lack of discussion around women, right? And equality, right? That critical race theory has introduced us to so many things, but most of all, what I want to say is that critical race theory has taught us how to be disobedient to those things that we have learned that are innate to us, right? The idea that they are innate to us, that has allowed us to actually take a disobedient reading. And so I encourage people to take the very, very key tool of disobedience and move away, walk away from those things that you were taught, right? Walk away from those things that you were taught, that right, are doing injury, as Anthony talked about, to other folk. And find your way to actually subtly and sometimes even explicitly undo some ways of thinking, either through reading, through action, or through collaboration with folks that you normally would not do collaborations with.
Reading, through action, and through collaboration. So we have really come to the end of tonight's discussion, and there are still so many good questions in the chat, so I'm sure that they'll be captured somewhere. This sounds like it'll be a part one of an ongoing conversation with these folks. We can't guarantee these same panelists back at the same time together, but we know that there's some exciting stuff happening in the university, but also in the greater Rochester community. I, as a host, just want to thank, as a facilitator, want to thank Dr. Joanne Larson, Dr. Jeffrey McCune, Anthony Plonzinski Figueroa, and Elisa Prince for being such wonderful and dynamic panelists. And thank you all for your work and your hands on the proverbial plow, because I think that so many times we don't understand the bounty that we have in our own communities. And so I just want to thank you for that. So thank you again to all of you for sharing your insight and experiences. Jeffrey, thank you for your suggestions at Reading and at Disruption. And I want to invite you all to join Dr. Jeffrey Q. McCune for next month's installation of Real Conversations, Biopsychosocial Model, Gender Healthcare Equity, where he will be moderating the discussion. Event details will be in the chat. Thank you also to everyone who joined us for today's program. Thank you again to the Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement for putting on this important and timely program in partnership with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, the Diversity Advisory Group, and the Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies. You will now be directed to a brief survey to share your feedback on this program and have an opportunity to suggest ideas for future events. I am Takia C. Graham. Thank you again, and Meliora.